December 7th, 1941, a day that changed the world forever. The calm before a storm that no one could have predicted. This was the day that would shift the course of history and bring the United States into the heart of World War II. For the men stationed at Pearl Harbor, it was a morning like any other, until the sky darkened with the roar of Japanese bombers, marking the beginning of an unprecedented attack. The attack on Pearl Harbor is one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century, not only because of the devastation it caused, but because of the way it altered the trajectory of the war. The surprise assault on the U.S. naval base in Hawaii by the Imperial Japanese Navy would push the United States into full-scale involvement in World War II, ultimately changing the balance of power globally. On that day, over 2,400 Americans lost their lives, and the U.S. fleet in the Pacific was crippled. It was a moment of reckoning that would spark a global conflict unlike any before. By the time December 7th, 1941 arrived, the world had been at war for more than 2 years. World War II had seen alliances form and break, and the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had rapidly expanded across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. While Europe and North Africa had seen the most intense battles, the Pacific theater was also escalating. In the US, there was growing concern about Japan's expansionist policies, but the country had maintained a neutral stance, trying to avoid becoming embroiled in another foreign conflict after the devastation of World War I. Despite this neutrality, tensions were building. Japan's imperial ambitions were evident in its ongoing military campaigns across Asia, including the invasion of China and the occupation of French Indochina. America had begun to impose sanctions on Japan, including restrictions on oil exports, a move that angered Japan. For Japan, securing access to vital resources, especially oil, was becoming increasingly difficult, and the US had become a significant obstacle in achieving their goals in the Pacific. Japan's quest for dominance in the Pacific was driven by a desperate need for resources. With its home islands lacking sufficient natural resources, Japan turned its attention to neighboring territories like the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, which were rich in oil, rubber, and other essential materials. The US had long been a key supplier of oil to Japan, but with the American embargo, Japan found itself facing a dire shortage. Without access to these critical resources, Japan's military and economy would grind to a halt. The US had become an obstacle to Japan's plans of expansion, and for Japan, the only solution seemed to be a bold, decisive strike against the American forces. Japan's vision was to establish a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a region under its control that would span much of East Asia and the Pacific. This ambition meant taking control of strategic territories like the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, which were not only rich in resources, but were also strategically positioned to control vital sea lanes. The Philippines in particular was under American control, and Japan knew that any move to secure its Pacific empire would have to include a confrontation with the US. The US oil embargo on Japan in the summer of 1941 was a critical turning point. Japan had already been engaged in an aggressive expansion campaign in China, and its reliance on oil imports from the US made the embargo a major blow. With oil reserves running low, Japan's war machine was at risk of grinding to a halt. The country had to secure new sources of oil to continue its military ambitions. Indonesia, with its vast oil reserves, became a prime target. But first, Japan would have to neutralize the American forces in the Pacific, particularly at Pearl Harbor, to ensure the success of their broader campaign. In response to the embargo and their desperate need for oil, Japanese military leaders devised a bold plan to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. The attack would be swift and decisive, designed to destroy America's ability to retaliate, buying Japan time to expand and secure the resources it desperately needed. The element of surprise was key to the attack's success, and the Japanese commanders worked hard to keep the details of their plans hidden from the Americans. The morning of December 7, 1941, began like any other at Pearl Harbor. Navy officers and sailors went about their usual routines, eating breakfast, tending to their duties, and collecting laundry. The tranquility of the morning would be shattered by the sound of an incoming siren. It was a signal that no one had ever anticipated. The Japanese attack had begun. As the first wave of Japanese bombers appeared in the sky, the alarm was sounded. For many, the sound of the siren was an unfamiliar, terrifying warning that something was terribly wrong. The moment the first bombs fell, the quiet morning was transformed into chaos. In mere moments, the base was under assault and the battle for survival began. The Japanese launched a meticulously coordinated attack, sending 353 aircraft, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter planes, against the American fleet. The assault came in waves, with each strike more devastating than the last. The U.S. forces, unprepared and caught off guard, scrambled to mount a defense. Battleships, aircraft, and military installations were hit hard, leaving destruction in their wake. The attack lasted for over an hour, but in that time, Pearl Harbor was forever altered. The result of the attack was catastrophic. The Japanese managed to sink or heavily damage 8 battleships, including the USS Arizona, which would become one of the most iconic symbols of the attack. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, and hundreds of American service members were killed or wounded. The surprise assault left America's Pacific Fleet in ruins, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in World War II. Japan's bold move had succeeded in crippling the U.S. military, but it would also awaken a sleeping giant, one that would soon retaliate with unmatched fury. Amid the chaos and destruction of the Pearl Harbor attack, one African-American sailor stood out for his extraordinary bravery. Though many were caught off guard and paralyzed by the surprise assault, this sailor sprang into action, demonstrating unparalleled courage under fire. Despite suffering serious injuries, he continued to fight back against the enemy, helping to defend the base and save countless lives. His selflessness in the face of such overwhelming odds would not go unrecognized. For his heroism, this sailor was awarded the Navy Cross, one of the military's highest honors. His story serves as a powerful reminder that heroism often arises from unexpected places, and in times of crisis, individuals can transcend the boundaries of race and circumstance to rise to the occasion. In the wake of the attack, the United States was thrust into war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan the very next day, marking America's official entry into World War II. The damage at Pearl Harbor was staggering. 8 battleships were either sunk or heavily damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans lost their lives. But while the loss was devastating, the attack did not break the American spirit. Instead, it galvanized the nation to rebuild and prepare for retaliation. America's industrial might went into overdrive as the nation began to marshal its resources, and the resolve of the American people was steeled in the face of Japan's aggression. By April 1942, just a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, America struck back in a bold and unexpected way. The Doolittle Raid, named after Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, saw a group of 16 B-25 bombers launch from an aircraft carrier to carry out a daring bombing raid on Tokyo. While the damage was relatively minor in terms of destruction, the psychological impact was immense. For the Japanese, it was a stark reminder that their home islands were vulnerable and that the war was far from over. The raid also boosted American morale and sent a clear message that the United States would not be intimidated. The tides of war were beginning to turn. The war raged on for another 4 years, with fierce battles in the Pacific that saw both sides suffer tremendous losses. The Battle of Midway in 1942 proved to be a pivotal moment, where American forces dealt a crushing blow to the Japanese fleet, significantly weakening Japan's naval power. From that point on, the balance of power began to shift. The United States, backed by its allies, pushed Japan back, reclaiming territory and dealing heavy blows to their military. The campaign would eventually culminate in the brutal final stages of the war, with Japan's defeat seeming inevitable, but it would take a drastic step to bring the conflict to a close. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, first on Hiroshima on August 6th, and then on Nagasaki 3 days later. The bombings caused unparalleled devastation, killing an estimated 200,000 people, many of them civilians, and leaving both cities in ruins. The overwhelming power of the atomic bomb forced Japan to surrender, bringing an end to World War II. The human cost of nuclear warfare was staggering, and the bombings raised profound moral and ethical questions that have persisted to this day. For Japan, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is one of profound loss and trauma. For the world, it marked the dawn of the nuclear age, forever changing the course of history. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, reverberated throughout history, altering the trajectory of World War II and reshaping the world order. It not only marked the United States' entry into the war, but also led to the unprecedented use of nuclear weapons, forever changing global politics and warfare. The ripple effects of that single day are still felt today, in both the physical and psychological scars of those who lived through it. Pearl Harbor was more than an attack. It was a catalyst that propelled the world into a new and uncertain future. A single day reshaped the world. The ripple effect of December 7th, 1941 still echoes in history today. What are your thoughts on the Pearl Harbor attack and its lasting impact? Leave a comment below and share your perspective on how this pivotal moment in history still influences the world today.